So before we get started, I want to say thank you to CAN TV for covering this event this evening. We will have the link to it, and if any of you are interested in watching it later, just reach out to the Mansfield Institute. I'm Heather Dalmage. I'm the director of the Mansfield Institute. Wow. I just feel like repeating that. So I want to say some quick thank yous. I have to thank the Mansfield Scholar activists, Katia, Samantha, and Vanessa Martinez. They are doing incredible work through the Mansfield Institute, and we've got some wonderful programming coming up. Let me tell you about two events, and then I'll go back to the thanks. On April 20th, we're going to be offering an educational advocacy workshop. We're partnering with the Illinois State Board of Ed. It's a one-day training. You can get paid to come on that day. You'll get a stipend, and it's going to be a really great training. I've been through it. And on April 10th, Raise Your Hand Illinois is coming to campus to speak to our students at 12:30. And if you're interested in learning about what Raise Your Hand does, how they started the organization, thinking through how to put social justice into action, this would be a wonderful opportunity to learn about an organization that's been really successful in doing that. So some more thanks. Monique Mitchell, so many people behind the scenes. Monique Mitchell, who is responsible for all of this beautiful stuff, the outreach that we did in the university. Julie Rowan, the assistant dean in the College of Arts and Sciences with the outreach. Nick in catering for making sure we've got good stuff here to snack on. Thanks to Physical Plant for getting everything set up, AV, and a very special thanks to Esteban Montano. This year we worked together to do a One Book, One University through the library. He hosted the One Book discussion, and it was, for those of us that were there, it was an amazing conversation about your books. So it adds to the excitement. We are going to continue partnering, and we'll be announcing the next One Book, One University as soon as we've had time to figure that out. So thank you to Esteban. Okay, so I have bathrooms, refreshments, book signing. So at this point, I would like to welcome Lynn Weiner, Professor Emeritus of History at Roosevelt University. She was the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences for 12 years. Her undergraduate is in history from the University of Michigan. She holds a PhD in American Studies from Boston University, and she also serves on the board of the Center for New Deal Studies. She's also the university historian. And Dorothy Roberts has a very special relationship to Roosevelt University, and Lynn's going to talk about that.
This is such a great crowd. Thank you all for coming. As we welcome Professor Dorothy Roberts again to Roosevelt University, it's a pleasure to note that in a way she grew up here. Her father, Robert E.T. Roberts, was a beloved professor of anthropology at Roosevelt from 1951 to 1986 when he was named emeritus professor. Robert Roberts was a pioneer in African American studies, which began really early at Roosevelt in 1951. And he was a pioneer in what is sometimes called mixed race studies. Beginning with his master's and then his PhD dissertation at the University of Chicago, he studied black-white marriage, eventually interviewing more than 600 couples and their children. Professor Dorothy Roberts has inherited 25 boxes of her father's files on interracial marriage in Chicago. Robert Roberts was also a partner in interracial marriage as the white husband of Iris, a Roosevelt student and a Jamaican immigrant. As Dorothy Roberts told the Chicago Tribune, her father believed that people of all backgrounds could get along and that human beings could overcome their racial prejudices. That is a belief deeply embedded in Roosevelt University's legacy, and one which resonates strongly in these troubled times. It is good to remember that Roosevelt was founded just 6 years before Robert Roberts arrived, and that it was founded as an act of social justice when another college in Chicago planned to restrict the number of Black and Jewish students who they would admit. 70% of all private colleges in the United States did this during that era. Instead, the faculty, students, and staff of Chicago's YMCA College walked out and created a new institution committed to principles of equal opportunity, democracy, and academic freedom, including freedom of inquiry. And so as we welcome Professor Dorothy Roberts to speak this afternoon, it's really wonderful to take a moment to remember her father, Professor Robert E.T. Roberts, and his life and work in the service of social justice. Thank you.
So this is, for me, such a special lecture. We are able to offer it each year and align it with a One Book, One University. And it's made possible because of the generosity of the Mansfield Family Foundation. And so I hope that you'll all join me in thanking a few members of the foundation who are here this evening: Mimi Hopmeyer, Bonetta Mansfield, and Gary Hopmeyer. In 1999, this institute, the Mansfield Institute, was created because on the sort of in part of the history of Roosevelt University, founded around the principles of social justice. And the Mansfield Institute has a mission of keeping social justice central to the work that we're doing in the university, keeping it alive more than just discourse. Discourse matters, but more than just discourse, actually putting it into action in the community. So what I would like to do now is tell you a little bit about our speaker and then turn the mic over to her. Dorothy Roberts is at Penn. She is the 14th Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor with joint appointments in the Department of Africana Studies and Sociology and Law School, where she holds the inaugural Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mossel Alexander Chair. She is also the founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society in the Center for Africana Studies. Her books include Fatal Intervention, Shattered Bonds, Killing the Black Body, more than 100 scholarly articles and chapters, and she's the co-editor of 6 books. She teaches courses in critical race theory, criminal law, family law, current controversies in child welfare policies, and race, biotechnology, and law in the gene age. So without further ado, I'm turning the mic over to Dr. Dorothy Roberts.
Oh my, well, thank you so much, Heather, for that introduction and for inviting me. Thanks to the Mansfield Institute and the Mansfield Foundation for making this possible. Thank you, Katya and Samantha and Vanessa, for all your help in bringing me here. And thank you, Lynn, for that beautiful tribute to my father. That was unexpected and just a wonderful surprise. I feel like I have to say something more about that, which is just to thank Roosevelt. I certainly wouldn't be doing the work I do today if it wasn't for Roosevelt. It was a really important part of my father's life. He spent his whole academic career here, over 30 years, and he found the support here for the pretty radical work he was doing on interracial marriage in Chicago. And of course, he met my mother here, who was his student and became his research assistant and then his wife on the project. So I literally wouldn't be here without Roosevelt. But I think without that progressive social justice orientation that, of course, shaped him as he was shaping Roosevelt in its early years, I wouldn't have the view of humanity that I have now. And as I've been working on my latest project on dispelling the myth that the human species is divided into biological races, I have become more and more appreciative of my parents' message to me throughout my childhood as far back as I can remember, that there is only one human race, and all human beings are absolutely equal and deserving of equal respect and humanity. And that message is more important today than it ever has been. And so thanks to Roosevelt for helping my parents teach me that message. So I'm also really excited and grateful that Roosevelt made Killing the Black Body the book for the, what do you call it, One Book, One Roosevelt? One Book, One University. That's such an honor. I can't tell you how honored I am by that. And so I guess that means that a lot of you have read Killing the Black Body, and so I will just give you some of my thoughts and reflections on the 20th anniversary of the book, and would love to spend some time discussing your questions and thoughts about it as well. So with the 20th anniversary edition, I had the opportunity to reflect on what had happened in those intervening 20 years in terms of reproductive rights and justice and what I wrote about in the book. And I write in the preface that I was filled with a mix of exasperation and expectation, thinking back over writing it and then what had transpired over 20 years. Exasperation because every single issue I wrote about in the book was still going on today, and in fact, in many ways had expanded, was punishing even more women than at the time I wrote Killing the Black Body in 1997, was becoming incorporated into law in ways that didn't exist and that I had just predicted and written against, but unfortunately were still being practiced in the United States. And so in a way it was kind of depressing to think back on it. And I want to talk about how some of the policies I wrote about, some of which were just being created, even though they were rooted in a long history of devaluation of Black motherhood, how those policies now were becoming even more embedded into U.S. Policy and culture and ideology and legal institutions. But I also, thinking about the 20 years, was really excited and filled with expectation, because when I wrote Killing the Black Body, there was no organized reproductive justice movement. It was just beginning. In fact, the word had just been coined as I was finishing the final draft of Killing the Black Body. Again, of course, rooted in a long history of Black women's resistance to reproductive oppression. But the actual organizing around a term of reproductive justice was in its very infancy. And so I saw over the 20 years in between how this movement had become so powerful that we were already criticizing people using the term without really understanding it. The language of reproductive justice was so broad that even mainstream reproductive rights organizations were adopting it, sometimes without fully understanding what the term meant. And I could point to experiencing the hope of organizing with others for reproductive justice and point to victories that reproductive justice organizing had accomplished. That was all new. So it was a strange experience of thinking, wow, nothing has changed. It's all these same policies are even worse than they were in 1997. But on the other hand, saying, wow, there's this magnificent movement that has developed and that I've been able to be a part of because I was writing this book as it was being organized, and so could be on the ground floor of organizing efforts and see how my book could be useful to reproductive justice organizers, which is the best thing you could say about a book, is that it can be useful for good, for change. So let me spend a little time going back to where it all started, and that was in 1988. I had been practicing law in New York City, and because of my concern for reproductive justice, or then we would call it reproductive rights, and some of what I saw going on, I decided I wanted to go into teaching and scholarship so I could do more in-depth research on these policies and help with organizing from a different vantage point. And so I joined the faculty of Rutgers Law School in Newark, another very progressive school, in 1988, and began working initially on a law review article, which ended up being called Punishing Drug Addicts Who Have Babies, Women of Color, Equality, and the Right of Privacy. And it was based on my alarm at reading about the prosecutions of women who use drugs during pregnancy. This was new. Prior to this period, women were not prosecuted for their behavior during pregnancy. And in conjunction with the so-called war on crack and the association of crack cocaine with black communities, prosecutors were beginning to turn their attention to women who smoke crack cocaine during pregnancy. And very often, the articles I was reading in the newspaper about it didn't make any mention of race, and the feminist writing about it didn't bring in racism into its criticism of these prosecutions. They were basically seen as a fetus versus mother type of conflict, and it was seen as a form of gender discrimination for those few who were willing to oppose it. This was a popular way of treating this health problem at the time. And I suspected that the women who were being prosecuted were black women. And I began to look into it with the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project, which at the time was one of the only organizations that was really challenging these prosecutions. The mainstream reproductive rights organizations like Planned Parenthood and NARAL, they weren't touching this topic at all. They were purely abortion rights organizations and weren't really sure what to do with the punishment of women who wanted to have their babies. And the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project was one of the few organizations that was tackling this. And I got from them a memo on all the cases that they either defended or knew about, and it listed all of their lawyers, the lawyers of these women, and I called up every lawyer and asked, what is the race of your client? And 80% told me they were black women. And I knew that there was no more use among black women of drugs during pregnancy than among other women, and that this was a form of racism and discrimination against these women. And I wanted to describe what was going on. And I began to think of this as not anything having to do with protecting the unborn children. It was about punishing these women for having babies. And that got me interested into the whole long history of the devaluation of black women's childbearing. And I discovered that black women had been horribly punished for having babies, including sterilization abuse against them. And I defined this as a intersecting problem of race, class, and gender, and described it as a way of turning a public health problem into a crime based on the dehumanization of black mothers. So, as I said, one of the other things I wanted to do is intervene in the almost total focus on abortion rights as the only important reproductive freedom. At that time, that's what most Americans, maybe it's true today too, think of when you say reproductive rights. They think all that means is the right to terminate a pregnancy, which should be a right and is a right, but it's not at all the full scope of the freedoms that we need in order to have control over our reproductive lives and equal participation in society. And for Black women, the devaluation of our childbearing was just as important and just as oppressive as preventing women from having abortions. And so I criticized in Killing the Black Body this focus on abortion and advocated for a broader view of what it takes to have true reproductive freedom and equality in society, and how important it was to put the oppression of Black women at the center, to really understand the meaning of reproductive freedom and to understand the ways in which reproductive freedom had been regulated, denied, and very narrowly defined in the United States. So I thought in order to do this, I had to go all the way back to the time of slavery. And many people bristle when you bring up slavery and they want to say, oh, it was so long ago, can't we get over it? But it's important to remember that for African Americans, most of the history of Black people in America was a history of being enslaved. For most of US history, Black people were enslaved. So it's not just a little thing, it hugely shapes the very idea of freedom in America, because freedom in America was defined in a way that allowed the enslavement of human beings. And so then even after slavery, of course, there was another 100 years of Jim Crow segregation. So even legal freedom, let alone real freedom in America, is a very tiny portion of US history. So it's absurd to say it doesn't matter. It's what founded this nation and has an effect. And one of the effects of slavery that's often omitted is the particular type of enslavement of Black women. Because for Black women, enslavement didn't mean just, which it's a lot, but it didn't mean only, I don't mean to minimize, it didn't mean only coerced physical labor, it also meant coerced reproductive labor. And so Black women's childbearing was under the control of slave masters. Not to say they didn't resist it, but they had legal control and power over Black women's childbearing. They owned the fetuses of Black women before they were even born. So the idea that the separation of mother and fetus is some kind of modern notion is actually not true, because slaveholders could sell and devise in wills a fetus during the time of slavery, separate from the mother. And another aspect of it, which I didn't write so much about in Killing the Black Body, because it was only in writing my book, Fatal Invention, that I began to think very deeply about how the concept of race is reproduced in the United States. I realized that one key aspect of the biological definition of race is the idea that Black women produce the disadvantaged status of their children, as opposed to societal structural inequities producing it, and that this idea of Black women producing the status of their children actually arose in the 1600s in the United States, initially when the white settlers in Virginia passed a law in 1622 that determined the status of children born to enslaved black women and fathered by white slaveholders. And they literally, in the preamble, they say, whereas there are doubts about the status of children born to a Negro woman and fathered by an Englishman. Remember, they were Englishmen still at that time. This is before the founding of the nation. And think about it. You know, we today, we think, oh, it's obvious that, for example, I'm black, even though my father's white. That's obvious you're black. It's obvious Barack Obama is black. That's just natural. But in fact, someone had to invent that rule. And in Virginia, it was made up in 1622. They could have said that those children were white. They had the status of their fathers. Usually fathers want their children to have their status, and they have the power to do it. But in this case, they didn't want to do it that way. Why? Because if their children were white, that would expand the numbers of people who could claim the privilege of whiteness. And it would start getting confusing. It's easier if you say, oh, there's a pure white race that's superior, and they get to be slaveholders. That's easier to control and govern and enforce. If you have these little brown children running around and they're also white, and they get to be slaveholders, it starts to get difficult to control. So also, if we can enslave those little brown children, even though they're our children, but if we can say by creating the concept of race, they're different kinds of human beings, then we can enslave them. And we can have no shame that we enslaved our own children, because actually they're not really ours. They're not even really human. I think this is the power of race. It can even make someone think their own children are a different species from them. Okay, so all of that goes into the reproductive control of black women and defining their children as enslavable. But more broadly speaking, defining that subordinated, disadvantaged, dehumanized status as not coming from the slaveholders that created it, literally wrote it into law, but coming from the reproduction, the natural reproduction of black women. Okay, so this idea in the 1600s in the United States, I would say continues to this day in policies I'll talk about in a minute. You know, current day policies that blame black mothers for the disadvantaged status of their children. They reproduce it. It's not from structural racism, it's from black women's wombs. Okay, so remember that. Coming out of 1622, and think about how it reverberates through everything else I'm gonna say, right? And then when people say, oh, forget slavery, it didn't make a difference. You know, here's one example among many where it does make a difference, because the same ideology is still operating today. All right, I moved on to really question the way in which most Americans, including many feminists, have described the campaign for birth control in the United States as a completely progressive, freeing, liberating part of US history for women. And I argue in Killing the Black Body that we cannot think of birth control and its history in the United States as a liberating story when birth control was being used at exactly that same time to forcibly sterilize thousands upon thousands of people on the dangerous claim that they inherited harmful antisocial traits. It's important to remember the eugenicist movement in the United States not only occurred at the same time as the early birth control movement, but they were coordinated efforts. And so while it is true that birth control provides freedom and liberation, it at the same time can be used as a tool of oppression. And we have to always remember that. And also remember that in the United States, this oppressive use as a population control measure was intimately entangled with its use for liberation of women. And that conflict, again, continues to this day with many even liberal birth control advocates arguing that birth control should be distributed to poor communities to save taxpayer money or to solve the problems of poverty. Again, blaming the people having children for their disadvantaged status instead of looking at the structural causes of poverty in this country. I should mention that eugenics, and another one of the important foundations of US policy today, people will say, oh, eugenics ended after World War II when the Nazis adopted US policy. I don't know if you are aware of this, but the Nazis modeled their sterilization laws and their anti-miscegenation laws against the US laws, which came first. And so when the Nazis' use of eugenics led to actual extermination of millions of people, there finally was in the US a discrediting of eugenicist theory, which had been upheld until that point, upheld even by the US Supreme Court in Buck versus Bell. And many people say, well, that was the end of it in the United States. But one clear example is the Eugenics Board in North Carolina that continued working. It continued operating, never stopped after World War II. It went all the way into the 1970s, and by that point it was primarily ordering the compulsory sterilization of black women who were on welfare. Prior to that, during its earlier years, it was mostly sterilizing poor white people in the state of North Carolina on the pretense that they were incapable of caring for themselves, so it was better to sterilize them than produce another generation of burdens on society. Now, I also point out in Killing the Black Body how these ideas about black women have been promoted with very powerful myths, stereotypes about black mothers especially, and especially about black women's sexuality, irresponsible sexuality, and childbearing, beginning with the myth of the black Jezebel, who was supposed to be innately sexually licentious, and so she could not be raped. She could always be the blame for any immoral sexual behavior, even if she herself was sexually assaulted. But of course, during slavery, black women had no legal rights to complain, and so they were routinely sexually assaulted by slaveholders. And then the myth of the black mammy was supposed to be the exact opposite of the Jezebel. She was supposed to be unattractive and caring, no care for her own children or her own interests, only caring for the white children of her master. And at the same time, she wasn't supposed to have any interests of her own or rights of her own. She was always under the supervision of the master and mistress. And this set up this dichotomy between the bad black woman who is natural and sexual and dangerous and the good black woman who is asexual and completely subservient to white people. Those two kind of combined in the 1980s under Reagan, when Reagan and others in the media, created the myth of the black welfare queen. And this was supposed to be a black woman who had babies just to get a welfare check. She wasn't interested in having children, really, or taking care of her children. She was just selfish and interested in herself and ripping off taxpayers. And so she would have babies so she could get more welfare benefits and then spend them on herself instead of on her children. And this was a very powerful image. Welfare queen became a household term that helped to fuel the abolition of the entitlement to welfare. So into the 1990s, as I was finishing the book, there was this explosion of proposals and rhetoric about solving the problems of black poverty by somehow getting black women to use long-acting contraceptives or be sterilized. There were proposals to pay women, black women who were addicted to crack cocaine, to be sterilized. I think that started right here in Chicago, as I recall. There were proposals in state and legislatures and in Congress to mandate sterilization or Norplant. That's a long-acting reversible contraceptive, but surgically implanted, surgically removed, that would be the answer to black poverty. And even in Philadelphia, supposedly liberal city, the main newspaper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, put out an editorial arguing that the main reason more black children are living in poverty is that the people having the most children are the least capable of supporting them, and he proposed that Norplant was the solution. Just stop these women from having babies and we'll put an end to black child poverty. All of that is false, by the way. I mean, we could talk later in discussion about the evidence that it is not childbearing that is the cause of poverty. And as I said, this ultimately led to these two laws, which were being debated in Congress as I was putting the finishing touches, on my final draft of Killing the Black Body. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which ended the federal entitlement to welfare, turned it basically into a behavior modification system for cash-poor women to push them into low-wage work, push them into marriage, and keep them from having babies. And then a lesser known statute the following year, but I see them as very much related, the Adoption and Safe Families Act, where Congress attempted to deal with the problem of an way overpopulated foster care system, because the United States had begun to rely on foster care, taking children away from their mostly impoverished parents as a solution to child poverty. And of course, it had reached hundreds of thousands of children. And instead of saying, well, let's support these families, just like welfare could be designed to support families, along with abolishing welfare, the Congress also said, well, instead we'll speed up termination of parental rights so these children will be adopted. And so both of these were measures that instead of supporting families in need, it was to take their children, keep them from having children, and take their children away from them. I also have a chapter in the book about high-tech reproduction, primarily in vitro fertilization, because it was very startling to me, the contrast between all of these policies being passed, the prosecutions, the ending of welfare, the Adoption and Safe Families Act, at a time when the fertility industry was turning into a multi-billion-dollar industry, and was seen as a positive way for helping white people have more children. And so I talk about in the book the images surrounding high-tech reproduction, which at the time were exclusively of white people, and images that showed the more white babies being born, the better. And white babies being the answer to people's dreams. Anytime black children were mentioned in any stories having anything to do with high-tech reproduction, it was because they were a mistake. There were stories where white women were mistakenly given a black man's sperm, or their egg was fertilized with a black man's sperm, and the baby came out too dark, was defined as black, again, even though the mother was white, defined as black, and as being completely different from the mother. And so in some of these cases, the white mother sued the fertility company, not just for getting the wrong sperm, but for getting black man's sperm and causing them to have a black baby. And the damage it caused to them and to the child to be born black. It's one thing, I think, and it is an actionable claim if you purchase something to not get what you purchase. But it's something else to claim that because your child is black, the child is not related to you in the way the child would be if it were white, when the child is equally related to you, regardless of the father, equally related to you. So again, another example of how race comes in to break kinship bonds and make it seem as if a familial relationship or even a genetic relationship doesn't exist, because race is more powerful. The invention of race is more powerful than the reality of the family relationship. Okay, so 20 years later, what's happening? Well, one of the main things that's happening is that we can see more clearly a concerted effort of punishing pregnant women and shutting down access to family planning and abortion services. One of the main things most dramatic things that happened during this period was that the US Supreme Court allowed states to pass laws that deliberately are intended to stop women from having abortions. And so they have passed hundreds of laws. They're coming down every day, to put all sorts of barriers. And the US Supreme Court has only struck down one of these laws. Last summer, it struck down a Texas law that put so many restrictions on abortion clinics that it looked like every clinic in Texas was going to close down. I mean, most of the clinics had already shut down in Texas. We're talking about a huge state. And so the Supreme Court said that went beyond. That was an undue burden on women when there's no clinics to go to in the state. But they've upheld, they've upheld a lot in the original case, and we'll see what happens in the future. But that was going on at the same time that states were ramping up their prosecutions of pregnant women, now for a broader variety of offenses than just drug use during pregnancy and beyond black women. So there's a lot of white women in Alabama, for example, who are being prosecuted and jailed for either using methamphetamines or being anywhere near a meth lab while pregnant. One of the first cases that expanded the prosecutions was a prosecution and conviction for homicide by child abuse by 21-year-old Regina McKnight when she had a stillbirth. And the prosecutors claimed that it was because she had used drugs during pregnancy. No evidence that that was why she had the stillbirth. The prosecutors did put on a doctor as an expert who gave just antiquated, ridiculous evidence that's what it was. And she was sentenced to 20 years in jail. That was suspended. And finally, after she served, but she still, I think it was 12 years, it was suspended to 12 years. After she served 8 years in prison for having a stillbirth. You know, so when a woman has a stillbirth, she should be surrounded with sympathy and care. Instead, they put her in jail. 8 years in prison. Finally, the appellate court in South Carolina threw out the conviction for ineffective assistance of counsel because her lawyer never challenged this expert's bogus testimony, and there was no evidence that she had caused this stillbirth. Another aspect that continues is sterilization of Black and Latina women. In California, it was revealed that there was a policy of either coercing or tricking incarcerated women, these were mostly Latina and Black women, into being sterilized. They should not have even been sterilized at all. They were incarcerated, so as far as I'm concerned, there was no voluntary consent, but the doctors even violated California policy to get approval for these. They just went ahead and did it without ethics board approval. And the doctor in charge said that no problem, he was saving California money by sterilizing these women. So again, we see the same eugenicist argument coming out in 2013. He was so proud of it, he told the reporter. This is a quote that he told the reporter. He was proud of the money he saved by avoiding all these unwanted children. Unwanted by whom? Not their mothers. Unwanted, he thought, by the state of California. And then another subject that I did not talk about in Killing the Black Body because it wasn't such a horrific state of affairs then. But since then, not only has the maternal mortality rate been way beyond anything in any developed country in the world, but it is actually going up in the United States, which no other developed country in the world has a maternal mortality rate that's increasing, and it is even apart from developing countries. Well, this doesn't show, this only shows for the developed countries, but even in most developing countries, the maternal mortality rate is going down. And the US has a worse maternal mortality rate, especially for Black women in some parts of this country, than in developing countries. In fact, it's safer for a Black woman to be pregnant in Rwanda or Kenya than it is for them to be pregnant in the Mississippi Delta. That's how bad it is. Black women also became more of a focus in the abortion debate in the last decade. It's always been the case that Black women's rate of abortion has been higher than white women's because of more unwanted pregnancies, because of less access to the kind of birth control they need and want, because of poverty, because of failure of sex education, and other reasons for unwanted pregnancies. But the anti-abortion advocates latched onto that to claim that Black women having abortions were committing genocide against their own communities. And they began a billboard campaign across the country with billboards like this: the most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb. Reiterating that same idea out of eugenics, out of slavery, that black women's wombs are what's causing harm to their children. Now, these were advocates who wanted to stop black women from having abortions, but it's the same language that would be used by advocates that want black women to be implanted with Norplant, or to be sterilized, or for their childbearing to be controlled in some other way. And so again, this idea emanating from slavery but being promoted through the eugenics era and into the 1970s and 80s and 90s is so resonant in US society that both sides can use it to devalue black women. All right, I also, since writing Killing the Black Body, have become more aware of the way in which institutions that are disproportionately targeted at black women and serve in various ways to punish their childbearing are intersecting and help to support each other. And so welfare integrates with prisons and with foster care and promotes this idea that the answer to black poverty is to keep mothers from having so many children. And within welfare restructuring, many states have adopted laws that deny to women receiving welfare any additional benefit if they have additional children. And that is deliberately to deter them from having children, and if they have them, to punish them and their children for having babies while already on welfare. In this same time period, there was an astronomical explosion of incarceration in the United States. Just like the United States has the infamy of having the highest maternal mortality rate in the developed world, it also has the infamy of having the most incarcerated people and the highest rate of incarceration of any country in the world, not just the developed world, anywhere in the world. And women's incarceration has actually increased more than men's incarceration, and this is mostly the disproportionate incarceration of black mothers. One aspect of the dehumanization of mothers by the prison system is the horrific practice of shackling women while they're giving birth. In labor and while giving birth, she's got one arm handcuffed to the bed and her legs are also shackled together. In some hospitals, her legs would also be shackled to the bed so that she'd be lying there with her hands up and unable to move during labor. It's physical torture and emotional torture, and has caused grievous injury to many women. It's very difficult for women in prison to visit with their children because of the number of rules and regulations that make it hard for their children to get to them, and the lack of resources to bring their children to visit with them. And so many of them have their rights terminated because they're unable to maintain a connection with their kids. After writing Killing the Black Body, I wrote a book called Shattered-Bonds: The Color of Child Welfare about racism in the foster care system, as I began to see that the devaluation of black mothers extended into the foster care system with the disproportionate removal of black children and termination of their parents' rights. And the belief, as the Center for the Study of Social Policy found in a study where they looked at the files of families involved in the foster care system and found bias in every aspect, but their conclusion was that the belief that African American children are better off away from their families and communities was what was really fueling these biased, harmful decisions. And so with welfare restructuring, prison expansion, and foster care, many Black mothers risk losing their children permanently. And for many, well, for most, that's the worst punishment they could possibly endure. I'm worried about time. I guess how much time do we have for this part of the program? Okay, all right, so I want to make sure I leave time for questions and answers and comments, discussion. Okay, great. So I also have been thinking about recently the new sphere, new terrain of what I wrote about in Killing the Black Body in high-tech reproduction, because it's a completely new world now. Not only is it becoming more and more routine for parents to choose the genetic makeup of their children through in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. That's been going on for a while, and as I said, it's promoted with images of white babies, even though more and more people of color are using these technologies today than they were when I wrote Killing the Black Body. But the new terrain is gene editing. Scientists have now developed the technique for actually editing the genes of an embryo and then implanting that embryo, which now means that every successive generation will reflect the modification of that embryo's genes. And we understand that rogue scientists have already done this. There's a moratorium now in the United States for reproductive genetic editing. So in other words, not editing the genes of somebody to cure a disease in that person. And you may have read recently there has been an attempt to edit the genes in a blind person so that they can see. Okay, but that's different from editing the genes of an embryo for reproductive purposes. That's going to change that germline for every successive generation. All right, well, I have argued that we shouldn't move forward on reproductive gene editing until we have a truly democratic debate about the ethics of it, where people who will be affected by it can participate, like people with disabilities, people who won't have the money to pay for these high-tech gene editing techniques, and more broadly, people who have an interest in social change as opposed to genetic change. And so, besides that, I've also pointed out that if you look at the images, I just got these images, if you Google gene editing and look at the pictures that come up, these are the kinds of pictures that come up. Once again, they're pictures of white babies. You can't make they always give them blonde hair and blue eyes, like that proves they're pure white. And then they attach, look at high IQ, all these traits that are supposed to be genetically determined and can be genetically programmed then. So the rhetoric, the imagery around gene editing has been to not just answer this ethical question about it a certain way, but also to promote the view that our traits, including traits like intelligence, the kinds of traits that make you valuable in society, are determined by heredity, and that they're associated with white people. And so this same problem continues, that, that 20 years later, same kind of imagery and ideology going along with high-tech reproduction. Okay, so that's all the exasperation. I'm going to conclude with the expectation and excitement. I was kind of surprised when I went back to read Killing the Black Body, to write my preface 20 years later, and I saw in my conclusion, I actually called for a radical vision of reproductive justice, and I used that term. And I said, now here I'm speaking mostly to people who are writing about and thinking about the meaning of reproductive rights, and I said we should explore how social justice could be made central to our conception of rights, of harms, and of the value of procreation. And so I was anticipating then, hoping for a movement for reproductive justice, and I'm really excited to say that that's exactly what happened over the next 20 years. They're developed, primarily led by women of color, organizations that are dedicated to reproductive justice, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. So, number one, we saw a problem with the focus on choice that mainstream reproductive rights organizations used as their primary mantra, because choice assumes that you've got somebody who can make a choice, who has the resources to make a choice, who the society isn't saying you're not entitled to choose for yourself. And so choice doesn't take into account that social and political context in which people are leading their lives and making decisions about their lives. It also can backfire if it's just seen as choice. First of all, people say, oh, well, this sounds frivolous. It's like what's convenient for you? It's almost like shopping. You have all these cereal options, and why should we protect the right to choose what makes you comfortable and convenient? It also means that if you have some abstract range of choices that are protected, and you're still living in poverty, or you're still unable to get a high quality education, or you're still incarcerated, then the answer is, well, you made the wrong choices. It's your fault. So choice doesn't really take into account the structural context that helps to determine what choices we even have at all. And so based on a concept of intersectionality that Black women in particular and other women of color have advocated for a long time, I would say even since the time of slavery, that sees the need to struggle against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and sees that they are integrated together. Reproductive justice centers on the experiences and leadership of women of color. It includes the right both to have or not have children, and to parent children in safe and healthy and nurturing environments. And we see it as part of a struggle, a broader struggle for social justice and human rights. So it's connected to the struggle for economic justice. It's connected to the struggle for environmental justice. It's connected to the abolition of prisons and foster care. It's connected to Black lives, the movement for Black lives, for example. It's also had a number of successes, like the March for Women's Lives in 2004, where busloads of women of color came to join with white women who had predominated the march in the past. And it was at that time the largest march of its kind in Washington, D.C. That, by the way, on your left is me in the middle. Marching with members of the Black Women's Health Imperative. And another great victory for reproductive justice was the Trust Black Women campaign, which was begun in opposition to the billboards that were going up and blaming Black women for committing genocide against their communities by terminating pregnancies. And organizations like Sister Reach put up their own billboards proclaiming that Black women don't deserve to be shamed for making their own reproductive decisions, and that we should be trusted to make the best decisions for ourselves, our families, and our communities. And that was successful in the sense that it sent this message out. It was a rallying cry for organizing, and it did succeed in bringing down many of the posters around the country, the billboards around the country that were defaming and devaluing Black women. So in conclusion, and I do want to open this up for discussion, I was really fortunate to have the opportunity, because of my book and what the research in doing it taught me, and reaching out to people who are advocating for reproductive rights and freedom, and seeing how I could collaborate with them, because I learned a lot about what were the assaults going on, what were the policies we needed to fight against, and also got a sense of camaraderie and inspiration, because people have told me, I can only read so much of your book at a time. I get depressed. I have to put it down. And believe me, I get depressed too, working on these issues. And it's so inspiring and hopeful to be able to work with people, as I'm sure you feel in the Mansfield Institute, right? That are also struggling alongside you, where you can hug each other during the depressing defeats, but you could also celebrate the victories and have hope that we can make a change, despite how dismal things look, especially now. But I believe that we can make a change, especially when we have each other, we share common values about our equal humanity, and we have the kind of frameworks like reproductive justice that give us the ability to analyze and to think about solutions in a way that's truly helpful to people and at least helps to end the suffering and hopefully to continue to build a better world. So I will end there, and I would be happy to hear your comments and questions. Thank you.
Hello,
Hi.
Dr. Roberts. I just wanted to make a comment.
Sure.
I feel really thankful that you made this program accessible. Your presentation was accessible. You didn't say a single word that I did not understand, so thank you for that.
Oh, you're
I really appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, I believe that it's important for people to be able to hear what you're saying. They may not agree, and there are people who, no matter how accessible you make it, they'll refuse to hear you. That's true too. But they won't have the excuse that they couldn't understand what I was saying. And I think that there's no need to use jargon to express even a very complicated idea. It's just, the jargon is just a way of condensing what could be said simply into a word that people don't understand. And you can also explain complicated things by a series of simple explanations. So thanks for saying that. I do aspire to be understood. Thanks.
Hi, I just want to say thank you so much for coming first, and then
Thank you.
secondly, I just want to say my idea about reproductive rights has like completely changed via this presentation, and I've learned so much just in this short presentation. So I just want to say thank you.
Oh, thank you. Man, you all are gonna, you're warming my heart. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think with Killing the Black Body and the other books I've written, my goal has always been to help people either to see an issue a new way so that they can be better equipped, if they have the willingness to do it, to help to change and resist and change. And it's just it's the best compliment to both of you. Made wonderful compliments that somebody sees something differently so that they feel equipped to go out there and join the struggle for making things better. So I appreciate that a lot.
Hey, I'm Freddie.
Hi, Freddie.
Usually I like talking and without getting nervous, but I'm a little nervous right now, so feel honored. So you mentioned where you was when you was giving your speech that about the accident insert of black sperm into white women.
Yeah.
And how the white women was getting mad.
Yeah.
If that were done today, maybe a sort of a trend where like white women were requesting sperm of color. From your personal take, like how would you one, how would you feel, and how would you think others would feel and see it?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, first I want to say that the cases that I'm talking about are the ones where white women have sued. So I'm not saying that all white women who have had this mistake happen have sued or would make that claim. But my point is about how the media addresses this issue, and that the media choose to to show negative images of black children as mistakes. All right. So I just want to make it clear. My point is about how it's portrayed in the media. I'm not making a blanket statement of what all white women do if they happen to mistakenly get a black man's sperm. Okay. And there may be, I don't know. Now see, I haven't seen any studies about this. I don't know about this, if there are white women who pick the sperm of black men. I'm sure it's happened, but I just have never seen any reporting of it. And so I'm not sure how, I'm just not sure how the media would address it. I haven't seen them do it. And so I just don't know how the reverse would operate, in the discourse of race and high-tech reproduction. Now, one thing I'll say is that high-tech reproduction highly operates around race. So sperm banks are organized by race, and there's increasingly careful steps taken to make sure that the sperm is categorized, is stored by race. So one company, for example, has a different color cap on the vial. Black sperm gets one color, white sperm gets another, Asian sperm gets another. And it's grouped according to the racial categories that we use in our society, although there's some companies that specialize in particular ethnic groups or subcategories. So the whole thing is bought and sold, the whole market is categorized by race. And it's an interesting area because, and I think that's a great question you're asking, because while we say that we want to move toward a race-neutral society or a post-racial society, certainly when it comes to this is a really blatant example of how most of us still think about these issues of family and making families according to race. And so it wouldn't be, you wouldn't expect that someone would come in and say, just give me sort it random. Let me pick randomly. Spin the dial and whatever. It's a multicolored dial, and whatever it lands on, I'll take that sperm, or I'll take that egg. People, I can't even imagine that. So, what does that mean? I think it's just a good question for all of us to ask ourselves. What does that mean? What does that mean? So, for me, I have focused on how the media looks at these so-called racial mistakes or mismatches and not questioned people's individual desires for a particular race of child. I tend to avoid that because I don't want to judge anybody's reason for why they pick a mate or why they pick a child, the race of a child. But I think we should acknowledge that most people would want to have something to say about it. They wouldn't want it to just be random happenstance. And I think we should also all be concerned about the way in which racial mixture is treated as some kind of horrific mistake. I mean, I'll give you another very recent example. Have you all seen the National Geographic issue, either the actual issue or the cover, where National Geographic has, in its latest issue, apologizes for its racism over the history of the magazine? And on the cover, they have these twins, one who had been in the press before, one has, darker skin and curlier hair, and the other one has fairer skin and blonder hair. Now, they label one white and one black, and they just came out with different features, like most black people have in their family, people who are lighter and people who are darker, and so we might look at it and say, oh, they're two black girls, one just it has lighter skin than the other one and a different color and texture of hair. But the press put this out, and National Geographic, I think, reinforced that, oh, how did this family have a white baby and a black baby as twins? And it's this constant, every time a black woman, I'm actually working on an article on this with one of my PhD students, these stories about black women giving birth to white babies because the children came out, fair and straight hair, and so they're labeled white. And the thing I'm focusing on is how this is supposed to be some kind of bizarre, bizarre occurrence that contradicts nature, but it's not contradicting nature. What it's contradicting is the idea that people of different races are supposed to have children of different races, and you're supposed to have a child that's your race and your race alone. And so when you've got twins that look like they might be of different races, it violates that rule. But it's not a rule of nature, it's a rule that's made up about these racial categories. And I think when it comes to reproduction, it really challenges our notions of race and family. And so that's what your question does. Your question challenges it as well. And so again, I would say I don't want to judge the reason why someone decides to select, a woman decides to select sperm of a particular race, but I do want to judge how the implications that has within our society because of the norms and ideologies about race and family. You're welcome.
And Freddie, you got the last question.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, Dorothy, we'll be doing a book signing, and we're going to set her up at the table over here,
Okay.
and I'm sure willing to continue whatever
Yes.
discussions along the way. So, thank you.